Hello and welcome. My name's Paul, and this is the Deep Support Podcast. I want to dive right into our topic for today, which is a deep topic, the meaning of life. And I'm going to say here at the start that I'm going to deliver, by the end of the podcast, an answer to that. What's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of all this? We're all born into this world, and life doesn't come with a manual. It doesn't come with definite explanations and definite answers. Although we as human beings are totally, completely wired to look for meaning and to look for answers, we feel a need to find answers to questions that don't just belong to our mind, but really belong to our soul. They are questions that aren't just of an intellectual nature. Something deeper than our intellect drives us to look for answers. Now, I'm going to talk about this in a storytelling kind of way. And in this particular case, I'm going to be relating a story that kind of transpires over a decade of my life. And so I invite you, whether you're driving or in a coffee shop, just hanging out at home, or wherever you are, I hope that as you're listening, you feel like you can just relax and be at ease and enjoy the ride. So, our story begins in the middle of Iowa, of all places. Iowa's a state in the Midwestern United States. The year is 2013. And I was in my first year of college at a small school in rural Iowa, in a small town surrounded by so many cornfields. That college is called Grinnell College. And one of the aspects that made going to college there unique was its isolation. When we're in a bigger city, we're surrounded by so many people and so much activity that we feel that energy around us, and it pulls on us to participate in it. Grinnell, in contrast, was disconnected from that, which meant that there was less to distract students from academics and what was going on campus. It felt kind of like a bubble to some of us, in the sense that we'd go there and have a lot of experiences in this sort of isolated container, and after 4 years, pop out and move on with our lives. And I was coming towards the end of my first year there. It was about April, and so we were coming to the end of a long winter as well. The winters can be long and cold in Iowa. There were times when we'd get snow as late as May, and of course some sub-zero days during the coldest months. So it was that time of year we'd start to have days where we could be outside comfortably without having to bundle up as much. I had started taking philosophy classes. I don't think I really knew what I wanted to do after graduating, but I couldn't really see myself doing anything else in terms of my curriculum other than philosophy as a major, because I had these deep questions within me, and I needed answers, and I felt that philosophy was really the only subject that was addressing them in a direct way. So I had started taking classes in philosophy. And I started to attract people with similar interests. I didn't know it at the time, but the people who would go through the major with me would become my best friends while I was at Grinnell. And one of these people, they came to me one day with a video they wanted to show me. To this day, I don't know why they wanted to show it to me, but we watched it, and I couldn't take my eyes off this video. It was the final scene of an anime show, which I later came to find out was called Evangelion. Now, at the time, I wasn't a watcher of anime, although I enjoyed it as a kid. And I had no idea what Evangelion was, or what had happened earlier in the series leading up to this moment. So for this person to show this scene to me was pretty random and out of the blue. What's happening in that scene is an apocalypse. And for some reason, all the characters are literally cracking open and turning into orange goo. At the same time, There's some strange humanoid beings floating up in the sky, stabbing themselves through the heart with spears. It seems to be part of a ritual. At the same time, one of the main characters is getting flashbacks of his trauma, and we're shown his inner world, which is shocking. There also seems to be a depiction of the death and departure of many souls to the next world as well. And while all this is happening, there's a song playing in the background whose title is translated as "Come, Sweet Death." It has a very melancholic vibe, and the lyrics say, "It all returns to nothing. It all comes tumbling down, tumbling down, tumbling down. It all returns to nothing. I just keep letting me down, letting me down, letting me down." That song kind of surrounds the whole scene and underscores the tragic elements. Even though I had no context for this scene, it was still very impactful to watch. For me, it was very disturbing. It was as if life had concocted up the perfect combination of ingredients to really trigger something deep-seated in me. After watching that video, something changed. I was still doing my schoolwork, but I became very concerned with finding a sense of greater meaning. I felt like everything was meaningless. I felt like there wasn't any meaning in life at all. And I need to say here for context that at the time, I was oriented to life in a very mental way. I thought of myself as a very rational person, and I thought if I just used my mental intelligence and my reason to guide my life, that would be good enough. That I would have the kind of life I wanted to have. But this scene from Evangelion rocked me on an emotional level. It tapped into some reservoirs of melancholy, apathy, and a sense of meaninglessness within me, and brought me face to face with those feelings. So there was that aspect, but there was also another aspect in the sense that I felt the other areas where I was suffering were meaningless as well. And because of my makeup and the way my life is played out, I've also dealt with a lot of shame and anxiety in my life. I felt a lot of those emotions. And the sense of meaninglessness was difficult because it also made me feel that feeling those negative emotions was also meaningless, that my suffering was meaningless. The philosopher Nietzsche said in his book on the genealogy of morality that human beings need a meaning for their suffering. We can endure suffering, provided it has some meaning, but we find it intolerable if we suffer without there being any meaning for it. And that was my issue, that my suffering in the form of negative emotions had no meaning. Everything was utterly meaningless. So I started to look for meaning in different places. I read a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which was written by a Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl. And I don't doubt that that book has contributed to people's lives. But for me, it didn't work. It didn't connect me with the sense of meaning. That wasn't what I needed. And I also looked back in a book I had read in my humanities class, a very famous epic poem called The Iliad, because there's a scene at the end of the book that really inspired me and moved me, in which the main character, Achilles, finally puts on his armor after holding back from participating in the war for almost the entire book. When he finally dons his armor, it's an epic, powerful, glorious moment. And something in me connected with that and felt that whatever that was somehow connected with the meaning I was looking for. But I had no way of conceptualizing that, no way of understanding that moment from the poem and what I was feeling in a bigger context. So it just seemed like another isolated feeling, albeit a positive one, but also meaningless. It was as if I needed something that could speak to my heart and my mind at the same time, not just one of them separate from the other. So all of this culminated in a moment where one night I was by myself in one of the philosophy classrooms on campus and was trying to work through this. I always fall back on writing to process my thoughts, process my emotions, and work through confusion. So I was writing. And this whole issue of meaninglessness that I'd been dealing with had made me realize the limits of my very mental approach to life. Some part of me had started to feel like this isn't all that life has to offer. This isn't the whole of it. There's more. And I also projected into the future. If I kept living my life the way I am now, with this very mental approach, how am I going to feel when I'm 90? And I could see and feel that I wasn't going to be fulfilled if I kept this approach to life. I was going to feel unfulfilled. So that started to open me to something else, something beyond my own mind. And the way the question came to me was, is there anything beyond the mind? And with that question came an opening. And I remember writing it and looking at the sheet of paper and the blank space beneath the question. And something started to dawn on me, that I'd heard these different authors, writers, philosophers talk about the present moment. I'd been hearing people talk about the present moment, but hadn't fully connected with what they were saying. And it was in that philosophy room, surrounded by all those cornfields, on a very cool night, just at the beginning of spring, that I started to wake up. And I started to realize that my mind was in the way of being in contact with the present moment. In fact, my mind seemed to be continually taking my attention away from the present moment to thoughts about the past and the future, whether it was an interaction I had earlier that day, the homework that was due tomorrow, or what my life would be like when I'm 90. My mind was always focusing on past and future. But I started to realize all of that thinking was just that. Thinking. It was all just happening in my mind. And what it wasn't was the present moment itself. And I realized the present moment was the only thing that was real. My thoughts about past and future were happening in the now. They were part of the now, but what they were pointing to was past nows and future nows, not something other than the present moment, actually. It's not easy for the mind to grasp because our minds are trained to think of past, present, and future as three separate things. And when we look to our thinking, that's true. But when we look to our direct experience without overlaying it with thinking, without imposing ideas onto it, we see we're actually just experiencing one moment, now. And that's all there ever is. What was the past when we experienced it? Wasn't it the present moment? What's the future when it finally arrives? Doesn't it always show up as the present moment? It's not straightforward for our mind to grasp this because it tends to think that past, present, and future are different, but the key is to look into our direct experience. We're used to looking to our thinking for the answer to a question, rather than looking at our direct experience, plainly, directly, without referencing our intellect. But it's by looking at our direct experience in that way that we have great revelations, particularly the kind of revelations that humanity has thought of as mystical or spiritual. We can label them as mystical or spiritual, or we can just say that our experience takes on a different quality when we relate to it differently, with mindfulness, with awareness, with presence. So the answer to, is there anything beyond the mind, was most definitely yes. And we could say that was the direct experience of life itself. Was that an answer to the meaning of life? No. No, it wasn't. There's more to the story. But it was the beginning of exploring a new dimension of life that wasn't mental or intellectual, a dimension of presence, of direct experience, of spirituality. And that gave me hope. It gave me a hope based on my own experience that there was so much more to life that I hadn't explored yet. And who knows what that part of life might be like. I looked at my experience of awakening to the present moment and how alive and real that felt. And I thought, if I can feel this just by stepping out of my thoughts for a moment, who knows what else is possible? And with that, I kind of forgot about the issue of meaninglessness. And you might ask, Paul, how could you forget about how everything is meaningless? I thought you were suffering terribly over that. And you would be right, and I have a good explanation for that, but I have to bring in some other pieces and go further in the story to make it make sense. So, flash forward 6 years, or I could say, flash forward to another version of the present moment. This is a few years out of college, and I live in Kansas now. At this point, I've been diving into the world of spirituality and personal development for a while, with a lot of curiosity and a lot of drive. That initial moment of awakening was also a reawakening of spirituality for me, and the beginning of a deep exploration of spirituality and different spiritual teachings. That drive I had to find answers stayed intact, but instead of going only into the realm of philosophy with it, which was merely intellectual, it came with me into exploring the world of spirituality. And by this time, I had explored a number of different teachings and didn't feel as if I needed another teaching or another modality. But a friend got me a free ticket into a personal development course that actually a few different friends of mine had been trying to get me to do. And so they created the opportunity for me to do this 3-day course, which I ended up deciding to accept. And I put myself in the course. Some of you listening might be familiar with the personal development company called Landmark. They are the successor to the EST trainings that were offered by Werner Erhard in the 1970s. And the first course in the curriculum that Landmark offers is called the Forum, which is a 3-day course. That's the one I was in. Now, Landmark is all about empowerment. Different teachings have different placements of emphasis. Some are more focused on love and compassion. Some are more focused on truth. Others are more focused on being of service to others. Landmark has elements of all of those, but the main focus is empowerment. And during the forum, all of the teaching builds up to day 3, to what they call the conversation of the forum. And they say, if I remember correctly, 95% of the forum is that 3rd day, meaning the first 2 days are really just preparation for the 3rd day. And as I was going through the course, by the way, we were in a hotel ballroom in Kansas City with big chandeliers hanging over our heads and big glass walls in the corridors. an environment that, in my experience, had a posh, opulent vibe. I was having a blast. A lot of fun, a lot of insights, and feeling a lot more empowered. And if you don't relate to the word empowered, I would translate that as we feel like we can take on life, that we can change our circumstances if we want to, that we aren't helpless, the feeling that we have the power to change our life. And up to this point in my journey, I'd done a good amount of meditation and emotional processing and different practices that opened my mind and opened my heart. But I hadn't gone very deep into the dimension of empowerment, so I was getting a lot of value from participating in the course. And I'm going to share some spoilers from the forum here, but I'm not going to say anything that's not already on the internet somewhere. So we finally get to day 3. And to give you a little context for the big conversation, or we could also call it the big teaching, the person leading the forum prefaces it with making you see how almost all of our human activity is mechanical, in the sense that we're always repeating the patterns that have been successful for us in the past. If we got accolades and social acceptance for being clever, for instance, then we're always trying to be clever. If we got rewarded for being funny, then we're always trying to use that strategy. Or if it was being nice that worked for us and translated it in our mind to ensuring our survival, then we keep using the strategy of being nice. And another part of the build-up to the big conversation was seeing how our minds are always making everything that happens in our life mean something. For example, if they didn't text me back, it means they didn't like my text. If I didn't understand it the first time, it means I'm not smart. If I failed once, it means I won't ever be successful. That's just a few examples of how we make meanings. And those are negative meanings. But of course, we make positive meanings too. We make everything mean something. And so in the forum, they get you to see that almost the whole of our human life is defined by repeating patterns from the past to ensure our own survival, and how our brains are constantly making meaning out of every little thing that happens. Human beings are, as they say in Landmark, meaning-making machines. And all of this builds up to the big moment in the forum, the mic drop moment, in which they say, life is empty and meaningless. And it's empty and meaningless that it's empty and meaningless. And it's a powerful moment for a lot of people when they get to that point in the forum, because at that point you've been going through this course for a few days. If you stuck with it to that point, you're invested in the teaching, you're engaged, and you just spent a good amount of time looking at your relentless addiction to making meaning, only to come face to face with the fact that all of that meaning is just made up. That life doesn't have any inherent meaning to it at all. And that makes for a powerful moment. In my experience, it was powerful and it was very liberating, very freeing. It felt as if suddenly I were lifted up out of all the meanings and thoughts that were, as human beings, were swimming in all the time. That suddenly I had transcended them and could see this bigger view. And in this bigger view, this higher place, so to speak, I felt free. Free from meaning. You might think that with a statement like, life is empty and meaningless, that would be depressing. But my experience was quite the opposite. It was very freeing. If you get depressed by the statement, you've got to realize that you're making the first half of it mean something. Life is empty and meaningless is the first half. But that itself doesn't mean anything. It's empty and meaningless that it's empty and meaningless. So if it seems like a depressing statement, it's because we make it into something depressing. We could equally make it such that we feel joyous or exuberant, if we made it mean something else. And where the teachers at Landmark go from there is, because life doesn't have any inherent meaning, we are the creators of meaning. We decide if something has meaning, and we can challenge meanings our mind automatically generates that are limiting or disempowering. We can be the powerful creators of our lives. That's the direction that Landmark's teachings go in. But the piece I want to take from this and bookmark is that it's possible to perceive life in such a way that, no, it doesn't have meaning, but rather than that being a depressing thing, or worse, a reason for despair, it can be felt as a very liberating thing. And it's feasible that I could end the podcast here by just saying, okay, it's possible to perceive it that way. It's possible to perceive that life is empty and meaningless, and you feel a kind of freedom with that, and just leave it there. But for me, there's more to it. There's more to the picture of why we sometimes feel as though we need things to have a meaning. We need life to have a meaning. And I want to speak to that. I ended up doing Landmark's programs for about another half a year after that, and I grew a lot during that time period in terms of self-empowerment and seeing through my own experience how I could make a real positive impact on the world. It was a real game changer. At the same time, even as I was very engaged with Landmark's programs and committed to making an impact through that modality, I still related to it in the same way that I relate to all spiritual and personal development teachings, as one teaching among many others. And I've found that while every teaching has positive aspects, positive to the point that they can be life-changing, they also all have their limitations. Landmark made a significant positive contribution to my life, but it wasn't my last stop on the soul train. I kept going. So, for the last chapter of the story, so to speak, we fast forward again to the current year, 2023. Or at least it's the current year as of now when I'm recording this podcast. The setting for this would be Colorado, since I've been living here for a few years. So you can imagine the beautiful Rocky Mountains are the backdrop to this chapter. But in contrast to the events I've described so far, this last part wasn't set in motion by something happening to me, not by someone showing me a video or getting me a free ticket into a course. Instead, I was circling back to a question that has been a long time presence in my life. And that question is, what's the point? It's a question that part of me asks, even when I'm very invested and committed to something. This part of me will still ask, what's the point? What's the point of doing this, of continuing with this commitment? And it took me a long time, but eventually I realized that this what's the point had two components. It had a mental component and an emotional component. The mental component was just what you'd expect it to be. It was my mind wanting an answer to what's the point? What's the reason for all of this? And if you take that question far enough, it's a question of what's the point of life? What's the point of creation? So it's very linked to, if not the same thing as, the same question I've been circling around. What's the meaning of life? That was one component. The other component was emotional. I could come up with good intellectual answers for that part of me that asked, what's the point? But I discovered that they were unsatisfying. They didn't bring about a resolution to the emotion. And the emotion was apathy. Apathy feels bleak and lifeless. The voice of apathy sounds like, I don't care about this. It doesn't matter. It's all meaningless. What's the point? I could offer big concepts and deep perspectives to this apathetic part of me, but it didn't help the apathy at all. I could address the mind's questions, but that did nothing to help resolve the emotion of apathy. As a side note, you may notice that in this part of the story, I'm going to use the language of part of me, as in, part of me felt apathetic. And that reflects the change and growth that had happened in the intervening years in which I'd started to dive more deeply into parts work, or voice dialogue, or internal family systems. It has many names, and what it's called depends on which system you're using. Parts work is a big topic in and of itself, but suffice it to say for now that doing this changed the way I was relating to my inner world significantly, and that's reflected in my language here. So as I stuck with this inquiry of how to help this part of me, the one that felt apathetic, and I got onto the fact that the mental and emotional aspects could be separated out. Yeah, this part of me felt apathetic, but when this part asked, "What's the point?" it didn't necessarily need an answer to "What's the point of life?" even though it seemed to be asking for that answer. It just needed help with its apathy. And I started to make progress with it when I realized that I could address the emotional aspect on its own terms without necessarily needing to give an answer to that big philosophical question. So one day this part of me surfaced, and it was feeling apathetic once again. It was feeling that, what's the point? It was feeling meaninglessness. And by now I've been at this spirituality and personal growth stuff for long enough. I was to the point that I could listen and empathize with and hold space for this part of me in basically the same way I would if I were holding space for and supporting another person. So this apathetic part had come up, and I don't know why, but I went back to listening to an audio story that had always touched my heart and moved me. And it's a story told by a Buddhist teacher about an eagle that spends his whole life in a cage, dressed up in an ugly costume. And he feels like a misfit and alienated from himself until one day, somehow, the door of his cage gets flung open. And without any hesitation, the eagle throws off the ugly costume he's worn his whole life, leaps out of the cage, and flies up into this beautiful night sky. Finally free, finally being his true self. It's a short parable called "To Fly Like This." And I listened to that, and it touched my heart again, and gave me this feeling of inspiration, which was very similar to reading the Iliad all those years ago, and particularly the part in which Achilles dons his armor. It was very similar to that in the sense that it was a moment of inspiration, activated by a story. And I noticed, after listening to the story about the eagle, the part of me feeling the apathy wasn't feeling that way anymore. In fact, it was almost as if this part of me had disappeared altogether. And so I checked in and asked myself the question, what's going on? What changed? How come you aren't feeling that way anymore? And what this part said was simply astonishing. It said it didn't need a point to life or a meaning to life. It just needed to feel a connection with spirit. And I understood that the story about the eagle served to reestablish that feeling of connectedness to spirit. Sometimes I'll be doing this practice of parts work and asking questions to my parts, and the answers that come back can be really astonishing. This was one of those times where the answer was not only surprising, but had, I would say, huge import. It had a lot of significance. And it was only as I was preparing to do this podcast that it occurred to me that the moment I just described probably made it possible for the next thing to happen when all the mental dots kind of got connected. That happened when I was traveling back home to see family, happened to be in Missouri, back in the Midwest, and I was writing about all these different spiritual teachings I'd explored over the past 10 years. Because, that's how long it had been since that initial moment at Grinnell I described earlier. It had been a bit over 10 years since that moment. And I was working on another inquiry that I may go into more detail about another time. But basically, it was dawning on me that however seriously we may take life, and even if great, enlightened spiritual teachers take it seriously, even if the wisest among us do that, that doesn't mean there's an ultimate meaning or a point to all of this existence. Even the evolution of consciousness itself can be seen as a kind of game. And not only that, we're in an infinite universe. This is the universe having an infinite exploration of itself. And yes, we can do things to improve our life and improve our world and help each other and all of that. And it's beautiful. But at the same time, there's not one singular thing or one description that captures the meaning of all of this. That doesn't exist. That doesn't exist. I saw this, and once again, just like I had felt during my first course at Landmark, I started to feel this huge freedom. It was, again, an experience of being lifted up out of something. I don't even know exactly what I was lifted up out of. It was a feeling of transcendence. Except what was different this time was that I had gotten there on my own. And I think that's important. At certain points in our journey, teachers help us get to a higher state or a higher consciousness, as if they're extending a hand and we're taking their hand and being lifted up by it. But in the journey of self-empowerment, we learn to get there on our own. We could use the example of learning to ride a bike. In the beginning, our parents teach us how to sit and balance ourselves, and they hold the handlebars as we get used to the feeling. But at a certain point, they let go, and we ride solo. We're doing it on our own. And so finally, I saw really clearly, life doesn't have a singular meaning or an ultimate meaning. Life doesn't need to have a meaning. It doesn't need to have a point. But it's almost as if I couldn't accept that when I thought I needed a meaning, or else I'd succumb to despair. The part of me that felt apathetic and despairing of life didn't need a meaning, it turns out. It needed a connection to spirit. And looking back, I can see so clearly, when I had that initial awakening to the present moment so many years ago, and I just kind of forgot about finding a meaning to life, it was because I got what I was truly needing. I needed a felt connection with spirit. When that reawakened within me, I got what I was looking for. It wasn't an answer or description or a concept that said, here's the meaning of life. Here it is in a sentence. No. What this part of me has always needed is that felt connection. And that felt connection can come online in many ways. Through stories, through presence, through spiritual teaching, and countless other ways. There's not one meaning to life. If anything, it's just the opposite. Life is so full of meaning that you couldn't limit it to one meaning even if you wanted to. If we feel that something is meaningful, then it's meaningful to us. It's as simple as that. Sharing a meal can be meaningful. Listening to a song can be meaningful. Meeting a friend for coffee can be meaningful. Heck, even taking out the garbage can be meaningful. If you feel it's meaningful to you, that's what matters. And it may not be meaningful for someone else. But it's for them to decide what's meaningful for them and what's worth spending their time on. That's a journey each of us get to explore. What's so meaningful to us that we devote our life to it? That's probably a good subject for another podcast. And what I just said may sound contradictory to the life is empty and meaningless statement. But here I'm not talking about a conceptual meaning or a meaning that our mind makes. I'm talking about the feeling of meaning. And lots of things in life feel meaningful to us without us needing to add conceptual meaning from the level of the mind. So what's the meaning of life? The answer is that's not really what we're looking for. We're looking for a felt connection with spirit. We could say that the answer is in that felt connection. And the paradox is we need the connection because we are that. We are spirit. We're not just connecting with something bigger than ourselves. We're connecting with the truth of our own being. Just like eagles imprisoned in cages and dressed up in ugly clothes that don't belong to us, we have to throw off the costume and be our real selves. We've got to learn to feel total freedom in our being and remind each other of this freedom. Because this is what makes life worth living. And that's the end of the story. If you went on that journey with me, I'm happy you came along, and I hope you'll tune into future podcasts. There's more stories to come. Feel free to share this podcast, and I'm wishing you a gorgeous flight up in the skies, in whatever form that horizon takes for you.